This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. This week we are talking about how Wyoming just banned conservation groups from bidding on oil and gas leases on state land, and how by doing so they might actually be hurting the school systems that they're obligated to fund. We also have a few recent news stories to share. I guess today is kind of the Wyoming edition. A lot of the stories are in Wyoming. A study was recently published that shows how human recreation can negatively impact wildlife by displacing them and keeping them out of areas for extended periods of time. We as hunters generally have a pretty good idea that when you get close to wildlife and make noise, it's going to displace them. But it is nice to have a formalized study that has data to back that fact up, that human recreation does indeed impact wildlife. To do this, researchers used a series of game cameras that would document wildlife movement in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. On some of these cameras, when an animal walked by, it would also trigger a speaker at a different location to play audio of human recreation. They tried to assess if certain activities had greater impacts, and they used things like the sound of mountain bikers, sounds of hikers talking to one another, and sounds of off-road vehicles driving by. Sounds of large groups of individuals talking had the highest chance of spooking animals, followed by moderate groups of individuals hiking and biking. Interestingly, the sounds of large groups of people were more likely to spook animals than even louder noises such as off-road vehicles. The study also looked into the vigilance of wildlife, basically how long they stayed alert after hearing these sounds. In this category, the noises of off-road vehicles kept wildlife more vigilant for longer than the groups of people talking did. They also broke the categories into different species, noting that elk were the most impacted of all the wildlife species and that large predators were the least impacted, often being unfazed by noises. These studies are really interesting, and hopefully they can help public land agencies and state wildlife agencies with how to handle increased human traffic on the landscape. Recreation isn't going to slow down anytime soon, and it's become very apparent that many of these activities are not as harmless as many would like to believe. Also in Wyoming, Joe Ricketts, the billionaire who had started to build a massive resort near a small town that was on a mule deer migration corridor, has halted construction. In a previous episode, we talked about the construction of this resort and how it had been seasonally limited at the request of Wyoming Game and Fish to limit the impacts on wintering and migrating wildlife. We also talked about how Ricketts and his agent had requested to change the seasonal restrictions to allow them to more efficiently build. Some of the Bondurant, Wyoming locals had been very upset with Ricketts for a multitude of reasons and were vocal in county commissioners' meetings to ensure that these restrictions stayed in place. Because of those costly restrictions, Ricketts has called off plans for building, as it was estimated to increase costs by $60 to $100 million and extend construction for an additional 3 years. The reaction from locals has been mixed, with some upset at the lost economic opportunity, with others glad to see that the resort is being halted. I would call this at least a temporary win for wildlife, but some of the locals are convinced that this is not the end of it. Time will tell, and we'll have to see. A story in the Wyoming Game and Fish Wildlife magazine highlighted the struggles that wildlife face when it comes to fences on the landscape. They noted that recent studies show how significant of a barrier fences are, especially for migrating wildlife. Through GPS collar data, they were able to identify areas causing the most problems, either by restricting movements or actually killing the animals from getting stuck. Woven wire fences combined with the top strand of barbed wire were the worst barriers, along with being the fences that were most responsible for killing animals when they attempted to jump them. These woven wire fences were historically often used for domestic sheep operations, but are generally not needed for cattle operations, which have largely taken over much of the rangeland. Wyoming Game and Fish is encouraging people to adopt wildlife-friendly fencing by either modifying current fences or by adopting these specifications when fences are replaced. So wildlife-friendly specifications have been identified to allow ample space for wildlife to crawl underneath, around 16 to 18 inches off the ground, and short enough for them to jump, being between 38 and 40 inches tall. Wildlife-friendly specifications are great, but I'm optimistic that virtual fencing will be the future for many ranchers. One of my friends has been assisting with a project that is testing out virtual fences on cows in Montana. I have read about the technology on several occasions, but it was really cool to see it in use in real life. And by real life, I mean on his computer screen. We were able to see the cow's location on his computer along with the digital boundary that he had set. The cows have collars on that begin to emit a sound when they approach the virtual boundary, and if the cows cross that boundary, they get shocked. He said that it takes a little while to train the cows to know what the sound and shock mean, but with a little help of herding them in the beginning, it sounds like they're starting to figure it out. This is pretty dang cool. I feel like it has the potential to be a big win for wildlife as well as ranchers. In time, virtual fencing could easily become more economical than having to build and maintain fence, especially for interior pasture fences. It'll be cool to see how this technology advances and is adopted in coming years. All right, not quite Wyoming news on this one, but close. Colorado. Anti-hunting groups in Colorado have been collecting signatures for a ballot measure to ban mountain lion hunting within the state. The desire to end predator hunting is almost always due to emotional rationale rather than biological reasoning. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has closely monitored and managed mountain lions within the state successfully for years. It has been shown that the population not only can sustain hunting, but also that hunting is a necessary tool to reduce conflict in the state that has seen a ton of increased development and increase in human population. In order to get the lion hunting ban on the ballot, they needed to collect 150,000 valid signatures. They just submitted their signatures claiming that they have 188,000. It's now in the hands of Colorado's Secretary of State's office to determine if enough of the signatures are indeed valid, but it's looking like it will likely be on the ballot come November. If it is, it'll become a pretty big job for Colorado hunters to tell their story and educate voters on what is at stake. With that, we're jumping into our deeper dive where we're talking about how Wyoming recently banned conservation groups from bidding on state oil and gas leases.
A lot of the things we've talked about in the past come to a head in this decision. And you're talking about
the basic idea was, there's oil and gas leases, and it could be on different land.
Right, state lands, federal lands.
Right.
Yeah. This happens to be the Office of State Lands and Investment owns this land, which the little history is the states were granted these lands in their enabling acts. The idea being these would fund your schools and other institutions. So you're supposed to get the maximum return on those lands.
Yeah, you're trying to fund the school systems essentially with these, right?
Right. Our state of Montana, there's 5 elected officials who serve on the state land board. Wyoming is the same thing. There's 5 elected officials who make the decisions for the state land board. The premise is you're supposed to do this as a trustee for the state's institutions, mostly primary and secondary education and the higher education, the university system. And so again, it's kind of this trustee sort of thing we've talked about with wildlife. But here we're talking about the surface of lands and the subsurface, which is the mineral rights.
Right.
So yeah, this is
and
this brings a lot of them together.
And what kind of started the whole controversy was the fact that these conservation groups that are not involved in oil and gas at all are trying to bid on these oil and gas leases within the most critical pronghorn migration corridor on the North American continent. Right. Yeah. So they have a incentive to do so.
Yeah.
But it's a different incentive than obviously what the oil and gas companies are wanting to do. These conservation groups have no intention of developing it for oil and gas. And so that's where people have been getting fired up and pissed off about it is like, no, you have to develop or you have to explore for oil and gas if you're going to be, getting this lease.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah.
So the state of Wyoming just passed new regulations that says conservation groups are no longer allowed to bid on these because they don't intend to develop them.
Right.
So even though back to this trustee thing, the conservation groups paid and offered to pay more than the oil and gas group.
Right. Well, and there was an example not too long ago that I think probably was the start of all of this where an oil and gas company won the bid for whatever. They were willing to pay the money and they won. They actually got the lease.
Yep.
But then they were mad because they found out that a conservation group was bidding
against them.
And so they're like, that's not fair. They bid it up unfairly and made us pay more.
Yeah, it's quoted here saying that we would have gotten it for $6 an acre had this group not have been bidding against us. This is exploratory acreage, and that $19 per acre doesn't sound like much, but for this exploration, which is the first thing you need to do before getting a lease. So they had to pay 19 because they were in a competitive bid, and they would have got it for 6. So they're upset that they had to pay 19 and didn't get it for 6. So they go to their trustees. So I'm going to use an analogy here. You're the beneficiary, Marcus. I'm the trustee.
Okay.
I manage a portfolio of real estate for your benefit. You're the school, but let's just assume this is a private trust arrangement.
Yeah, exactly.
One of my friends comes to me and says, Randy, you're currently renting that building over there for $24 a square foot. But you and I, we're buddies. You should rent it to me for $10 a square foot. And I say, yeah, you know what? We're pals. Hell with my beneficiary. You're not going to get the $24 a square foot that I'm going to have cash flow to pay you. You're going to have to just settle for $10 a square foot because my buddy over here needs a better deal.
Yeah. No, it does.
If I did that as a private trustee, and I'm the trustee of a lot of trusts, my ass would be in court so fast, I wouldn't know. They'd put me so far back in the pen, it'd be so dark they'd have to pipe light to me. I'd be so far back in the pen.
Yeah.
So this brings a couple things together. The trustee duties and political influence. It doesn't just happen in wildlife. And then it brings, we're starting to hear again about in the upcoming election cycle that we need to transfer these federal lands to the states. Mm-hmm. There's talk about that.
Well, and this has been back and forth for years
right
now. Yeah.
So who do you think is easier manipulated? This Congress that moves at even a subglacial pace, right? I mean, Congress doesn't get much done. Or states like this. So we transfer these federal lands to these state land boards, which this is the perfect example. And who do you think would then weasel their way through political process to gain the control and the access and the benefit of those lands that would get transferred to the states?
Yeah, and not only that, but just a lot of states have shown their true colors that they're likely going to sell those lands, or they're going to go for a short-term gain in lieu of what's actually best for the long-term situation, which again is not good for the school systems that you're in theory funding. Like, it's very short-sighted. You know, it's not a wise investment.
No, and rather than do it and say, hey, we're going to improve the management of federal lands, this is just the mechanism by which to sell public lands, or in this case, to give the use of them, the beneficial use of these lands to selected groups.
And the hypocrisy is kind of astounding when you think about it, when very often these same individuals are arguing for free market, economics in a lot of ways. And then when you are opting for making less money so it goes towards the industry that you prefer, then it's pretty hypocritical in my mind to do so. But
so anyone who doubts that these state land boards don't intend to sell this stuff, just go to the Utah, it's called trustlands.utah.gov, and look at sales and leases. They have sold 6 acres, 40 acres, 200 acres, 640 acres, 80 acres, 80 acres, 80 acres, 240 acres, 80 acres, 80 acres, 80 acres, 35 acres, 2,000 or 200 acres, 48 acres, 70 acres. Right. I mean, I could sit here and scroll. It's pages and pages and pages of stuff that Utah has sold.
Oh yeah, and we did a whole series quite a few years back about
2016. You and I did that.
Yeah, kind of a lot of the states, like what they've done, the history of what lands they've sold, and it's crazy what a lot of these states have sold, and pretty much no state was immune from it. Everyone participated in that. So anyway.
And so before anyone thinks we're out in the weeds here and we're some wild wing nuts, we all use energy. I think everybody who works here is a fan of uninterrupted markets, right? If we're real, like you said, if we're really free market people, why do you need to call and this happens in a lot of states. So we're just, because it's become a big deal in Wyoming, we're using that as the example.
Right.
This isn't just a Wyoming issue. This is an anywhere government is involved kind of issue.
Yep.
And if you really believe in free markets, why do you not want conservation values to be considered in that? And if you think this is a crazy idea, 100 years ago this year, Aldo Leopold, the guy who we all say is the father of modern day wildlife conservation, said the highest and best use for the Gila country would be no use, would be wild use. And he talked about it in the context of him as a hunter.
Yeah.
And we have the Gila wilderness. We have Aldo Leopold wilderness. And people say, well, that's just a waste. That's locked up for nothing. Well, this concept that there can be highest and best use that is not development, that is not disrupting the most critical pronghorn migration corridor not in Wyoming, in the United States, not the most important one in North America, the most important one on the planet.
Yeah.
Why would we not want conservation values to have that opportunity? And why would trustees go and interfere with the free market?
Yeah. Well, and then like to go back to that example, along the pronghorn migration path that you were talking about, there was an agreement with the state that they were basically not going to develop in that area because it was such a critical area, but then they went ahead with the lease anyway.
Right.
And so it's like, if you're going to argue plain unfair, like it goes both ways.
Right. And this is where people need to understand you have a game and fish department that recommended this is highly critical.
Right.
This is like, if we're going to have pronghorn to the degree that we do, this is a absolutely superb piece of habitat that please don't do anything with. Then you have another state agency over here that says, well, we've heard you and maybe we'll think about that, but you know what? I think we're going to lease it. Whether it's lease for exploration or lease for its actual drilling, that's not good for pronghorn. So some people said, we're willing to pay more.
Yeah. And so I guess the devil's advocate argument is that you're inflating the prices of energy and you're going to impact Americans because now you're increasing the price of energy, or you're pushing that energy development to other countries, or you're importing it from third world countries or whatever. So I guess what's your thoughts on that? Like,
well, my thought on that is we remove the oil and gas export rules of the United States, I think in 2005 or something like that. It used to be, there were pretty heavy restrictions on the U.S. being able to sell its energy because we had this concept of energy independence, right? After 9/11, we don't want to be vulnerable to, radicalized people. Well, since we've removed that, I can go find the screenshot and give you the link, but the United States was the number one energy producer in the world last year. So we're doing this to sell energy to other countries. It's not like we're compromising our own energy independence to give one little, just fractional, minuscule consideration to wildlife and conservation. So
I think in my mind, it's just like a collection of values of a lot of people value this resource, and it's like there's that one conservation group that bid that up, but it's a collective of individuals from Wyoming Game and Fish and the public that's actually like would prefer that alternative. They would rather see those pronghorn have an uninterrupted migration route and have that area undeveloped. And so it's not just like, everybody wants option A and everybody wants option B. And so there's always a compromise somewhere, but there's definitely some shenanigans going on
It would be nice if the industry said, you know what, we recognize some of these are superbly valuable, and we're just not going to bid on them Because do these few, I think there's 3 sections that are the critical ones that they ask to be withdrawn. Are they that important to somebody's bottom line? Or if they are that important to your bottom line, then you should have to pay market value for it. And a lot of people are like, well, if you extend that out, that's going to run the grazer off the ground. I get all that. I understand that there's got to be consideration to this. But when everybody on the planet says, hey, this is the most critical place out there, and then you have trustees who are beholden to get the maximum return for their beneficiaries, and they don't do that. In fact, they go around to create rules so that you can manipulate what that market value is.
Yeah.
That's all of a sudden you add all those things together. It's like, really? I thought, okay.
Yeah. And the nature of it is there's a lot of people who value conservation. Mm-hmm. And I think people like to put blame on the single organizations, but this, like I said, there's people who donate to those organizations. There's people that are wanting the same thing. So it's not just, I mean, you can make a parallel with what's happening with American Prairie in Montana too. Mm-hmm. It's just like we've talked about that in past episodes too, where they're going in and buying land that used to be in traditional cattle ranching, operations, and now they're putting bison on. They're taking fences out. They're what they say is rewilding the landscape, and a lot of locals don't like that.
Right.
And so, but the nature of it is there's pretty good group of people who do like that.
Right.
And it's hard.
That is the free market. They're paying willing sellers and a willing buyer. The Montana legislature has tried to come in and say, hey, this nonprofit can't own land, which if you're a seller of land, it's like, why are you taking one of these buyers away from me?
Yeah.
I might be able to get a couple million extra dollars.
Yeah. And then, I mean, even if I understand the perspective in that example of the local on the ground that's like, oh, you're taking my way of life. But at the same time, it's just like, there's not a lot of options for these ranchers who are selling. If they don't have a family member that's going to take over the ranch, it's like, you're going to sell
to the highest bidder.
And you're going to, ideally you're going to sell to the highest bidder. But even then, it's just like the options, like there's not a lot of people who can buy a multi-million-dollar ranch. Right. And so you have American Prairie, or you have the Wilkes brothers, or some other out-of-state billionaire. Mm-hmm. And, from a hunter's perspective, American Prairie's giving me hunting access. Mm-hmm. Wilkes brothers aren't giving me any hunting access. Yeah. So that's kind of, I don't know. I tend to look at things in the perspective of a hunter and angler, and from the perspective of a hunter and angler, I'd prefer to see these, like the pronghorn migration corridor. I'd like to see more pronghorn surviving in Wyoming. Right. And that's my vote, I guess, towards it. Is it's like I prefer this over a little bit cheaper, potentially a tiny bit cheaper energy. Yeah. And it's all about this balancing, I guess.
And if it costs me and every American an extra 2 cents a year for more energy, right, or for our energy costs because of these 3 little sections, I'll pay for a couple thousand Americans 2 cents a year, whatever minuscule cost. It wouldn't even come to that. It's such a small drop. Another parallel, you're drawing parallels here. I think this is a parallel to when George Bird Grinnell was fighting the railroads, because the railroads were coming out west and they were depleting the bison herds. And he was going to Congress saying, what are you doing? This is gonna be the end of bison. Mm-hmm. Well, they depleted them off the Great Plains, so the only group still left was in Yellowstone Park for the most part. Yeah. And there were politicians who were like, no, there's a lot of money to be made by exploiting that. Well, it's. I know some people will be like, "Oh, Randy, you're crazy." Their pronghorn aren't depleted to the level of bison. No, they're not. But again, we have groups of people engaging in political activity. I'd call it political interference, and we have willing trustees willing to compromise their role as a trustee with the state school system as the beneficiaries to accomplish that.
It's an interesting one. I imagine this is going to continue to pop up in discussion for us. Is this like, it's just the idea of whenever it's a bid or an auction or whatever, it's like you're going to have people with different values competing for that. And then when the beneficiary is losing out on a potential revenue source because you want to help your friends or help what X industry over Y industry, it's like, it's going to be very contentious it'll be interesting to see what the future holds.
And some people might say, why do you guys talk about this a lot? Because that's what we're here to do. Okay. The industry folks, regardless of what industry is, they have their mouthpieces. They have their platforms. They have their connections and lobbyists.
Yeah.
And they're talking about their side of it. I'm talking about it strictly through the eyes of someone who loves to hunt, fish, have public access, and wants a lot of wild things out there.
Yeah.
And if people want to criticize us for bringing it up and pointing out the hypocrisy of some of this, say it. Email down below. Comments down below.
Yep.
Yeah, we're not going away. I hope we're not going away anytime soon. And we're going to keep talking about these things because it's super, super important. And I think what it shows is in today's world of everything being so binary, you're either on this side or you're on that side. There's a lot in the middle. And the wildlife issues are the ones in the middle that we got to speak for. And a lot of people want to make it this simple black and white, you got to be on this side or you got to be on that side. I totally reject that idea. I reject it in every sense of my life. And I want to talk about where are these middles? Because this issue about what this society is going to place on demands of wild places and wild things as this population zooms past 340 million and is headed to 400 million, these issues aren't going away. They're going to be the issues of our time and the issues of our day. And I'm not walking away from that.
Great words to end on. Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, Marcus.
That was a good one.